Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Bhagavad Gita class, our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class. Sorry. Om Sarva Jiva Papanasha Karanam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashami drisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami deva deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravana Mangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana So this morning we will continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off last class. And so we are on June 15th, 1883, which was a Friday. And in this book we are 1/3 from the bottom on page 247. So this day, this Friday, was a holiday because it was the Hindu celebration of Dasahara. And so there were more people than usual on for a weekday. And among the people who had gathered at Dakshineshwar, there was both Rakal and his father. And so every now and then, Sri Ramakrishna directed his words to the father of Rakal, his father who had been against Rakal's coming to Sri Ramakrishna, but who himself came a few times, and Sri Ramakrishna spoke highly of his son and of him, saying that such a son could only come from good parents, etc. And so gradually Rakal's father relaxed his objections to his coming to Sri Ramakrishna. So now, in what we had just been reading when we ended last time, Sri Ramakrishna had been saying some very strong words about renunciation and the necessity for renunciation and even for householders. And so then we come to a question where a devotee asks, I find it extremely difficult for a householder to realize God. How few people can lead the life you prescribe for them. I haven't found any. Master, why should that be so? I have heard of a deputy magistrate named Pratap Singh. He is a great man. He has many virtues, compassion and devotion to God. He meditates on God. Once he sent for me. Certainly there are people like him. So Sri Ramakrishna mentions this man, Pratap Singh, as an example of a householder who at the same time has great devotion for God and wisdom as well. And so one of the things that we should learn when reading the gospel or other texts where there are such strong words of renunciation and so forth is not to take them as judgments of me where I am. That, Sri Ramakrishna is talking about me. I'm worldly like that, and what hope is there for me? No, take it as the presenting of an ideal which we can move towards. We don't have to be there yet to benefit from these words. We may feel a long way from there. I'm sorry, I just realized that I accidentally brought my phone with me, so I've got to turn it off there. That's out of the way now, so I don't get any disturbance. Uh, so we should take it as the presenting of an ideal that we can move towards, something that we approximate until we get there. And to think not in terms of what the demands are, which I don't have, but what the state is that he's talking about, where one is free from base desires. And then to try again, to try to approximate that. All of this is for our good. It's not Sri Ramakrishna judging us and telling us you're hopeless. No, he's telling us where we need to go. And he wouldn't be telling us that unless there was the power to go in that direction already within us. And so in spiritual life, it's extremely important that we not lose heart. Many people have told me that things like what Sri Ramakrishna is talking about, but that's the way I am. So he's talking about me as if Sri Ramakrishna were hurting their feelings. Oh no, that's not the intention. That's not what Sri Ramakrishna was trying to do. And when you find in the gospel itself that sometimes he gives very consoling words to people and tells them that they can realize God, that it's not so hard. That don't think about what you have to give up. Move to the west if you want to get away from the east. Don't even think about the east. Just forget about that. Just don't worry about what you don't have. Just to think in terms of where you want to go. And tells the householders that you have advantages over even the sannyasi, because you are like fighting from within the fort, whereas the sannyasi is out on the open battlefield without protection. So again, when he addresses words like this, which are strong, which again, we've already passed over that, but that was where we ended last time, and what brought up this statement of the devotee, then that's because someone or all of the people that were seated around him needed to hear it. There was some reason why the people needed to hear it, they were ready to hear it, or whatever. So, he continues, the practice of discipline is absolutely necessary. Why shouldn't a man succeed if he practices sadhana? But he doesn't have to work hard if he has real faith in the Guru's words. Once Vyasa was about to cross the Jamuna, when the gopis also arrived there, wishing to go to the other side. But no ferry boat was in sight. They said to Vyasa, "Revered sir, what shall we do now?" "Don't worry," said Vyasa. "I will take you across. But I am very hungry. Have you anything for me to eat?" The gopis had plenty of milk, cream, and butter with them. Vyasa ate it all. Then the gopis asked, "Well, sir, what about crossing the river?" Vyasa stood on the bank of the Jamuna and said, "O Jamuna, if I have not eaten anything today, then may your waters part, so that we may all walk to the other side." No sooner did the sage utter these words than the waters of the Jamuna parted. The gopis were speechless with wonder. "He ate so much just now," they said to themselves, "and he says, 'If I have not eaten anything.'" But Vyasa had the firm conviction that it was not himself, but Narayana who dwelt in his heart that had partaken of the food. So this is a famous incident, and a very beautiful incident, puzzling at first, of course, that Vyasa asks the gopis for all of these rich things to eat, cream and ghee and other rich things, and he eats all of it, fills his stomach, and then stands in front of the river and says, "O Jamuna, if I have not eaten anything today, then please part your waters so that we can walk across," and the waters part. That, of course, is based on the ancient idea. Both in India and in other cultures, you find this as well. that if a person is completely truthful, then and they make a truthful statement like that, then the miraculous can happen. That was the basis for the, I must admit, the very horrible and brutal and cruel practice of the, I forget what you call it, but it was the test that was given to criminals that if you are in you touch this red hot iron, and if you're innocent, you won't get burned, and if you're guilty, you will get burned. And of course, many innocent people obviously would get burned and were then executed. It was a horrible practice, so I'm not justifying that. But the basis of it was this. This understanding that if a person is completely truthful, then events will follow their words. And that, again, was believed east and west. So that is the basis of Vyasa telling the river that if I have not eaten anything, then part your waters. And the waters part and they walk across. So the gopis were thinking, how could this be? He just finished eating so much rich food, filling his stomach with all of the rich food we had brought. But there are two interpretations. One is that that the Nara, as the one that Sri Ramakrishna gives, is that Narayana, that is God, seated within his heart. Vyasa knew that God is the doer. I am not the doer. And that the eating was for Narayana, not for me. That is, he wasn't eating for his pleasure, but he was had the experience that he was feeding Narayana within himself. And that actually he was not even the doer, that it was Narayana within him that was eating. The other is the same thing, but from the jnani's standpoint, that is, that he knew himself to be pure consciousness. He knew himself to be the Atman, free from all action, and that all the action was the body and mind, but his identity was in the actionless self. And so he indeed had not eaten anything in his experience. He knew that, and so both ways, he knew in direct experience, that was his actual experience, that he had not eaten anything. Whether you take it as God having eaten within his heart, or that he was pure consciousness and it was the gunas of Prakriti that were doing the eating, but he had no sense of kartaham, I am the agent of action. So this was in connection to what Sri Ramakrishna said at the beginning of this paragraph about if you have faith, then spiritual life becomes easy. If you have faith in the words of your guru, if you have faith in God, if you have faith in the words of the scripture, any of those or all of those, if you have that faith, then spiritual life becomes easy, because what you have deep faith in, and not just verbal faith, that I believe in such and such because I say so, but my words don't mean anything. But no, deep faith, if you have deep faith, whatever you have deep faith in, that orients your whole being towards that. And so if you have faith in the words of the Guru, if you have deep faith in the God, if you have deep faith in the scriptures, then your whole being becomes oriented towards that. And then it's much easier to progress. Yes, there's still the time element. So those who have done a lot of work in past lives, they proceed very quickly if they have that faith. The rest of us, we may have developed strong faith, but because of the obstacles of past karma, we still have many things to go through on the way, and yet we begin to feel that we're being carried in that direction. We begin to feel that I'm on the train going towards the land of illumination. I'm on the train. All I have to do is to stay here. It will get me there. I may have started 2,000 miles away on a slow train, and somebody else might have started from just 100 miles away. And so they're going to get there quickly. For me, it will take time, but I'm on the train and I'm going in that direction. So in that sense, even for me, the path becomes easy because I know I found my place on the train. All I have to do is to remain here, and the train is getting me there. So that's a great boon in spiritual life, a great place in spiritual life if we can get to that. where we feel that yes, I'm on the train. I've boarded the train. Let it take time. Let it come quickly. But all I have to do is to remain on the train. So then Sri Ramakrishna continues with another example. Shankaracharya was a Brahmagnani, to be sure, but at the beginning, he too had the feeling of differentiation. He didn't have absolute faith that everything in the world is Brahman. One day, as he was coming out of the Ganges after his bath, he saw an untouchable, a butcher, carrying a load of meat. Inadvertently, the butcher touched his body. Shankara shouted angrily, "Hey there, how dare you touch me?" "Revered sir," said the butcher, "I have not touched you, nor have you touched me. The pure self cannot be the body, nor the five elements, nor the 24 cosmic principles." Then Shankara came to his senses. Once Jada Bharata was carrying King Rahugana's palanquin and at the same time giving a discourse on self-knowledge. The king got down from the palanquin and said to Jada Bharata, "Who are you, pray?" The latter answered, "I am not this, not this. I am the pure self." He had perfect faith that he was the pure self. So again, these are examples of faith. And so in the first one that he gives here at the top of the paragraph, he gives the famous example from the life of Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya had already become a great knower of Brahman and already written some of his commentaries, but he was going to take a bath and going down the steps when this untouchable was coming up the steps and brushed past him, touching him. Now, for those not from India, would have to know that in those days, and up until modern times, if one were going to take their bath Shankaracharya was coming from his bath. He had taken his bath, coming up the steps of the ghat, away from taking his bath, when the untouchable brushed past him. And up until modern times, if an untouchable touched a higher caste person after they had taken a bath, then they would have to go back and take a bath again because they had become impure by contact. That was why the people were called untouchables, because they weren't to be touched, because it brought impurity. And so, of course, the original idea was that they maintain one's purity for the purpose of spiritual practice and for performing yajnas and so forth. But as we see in every society all over the world, that practices that originally had some sense behind them, they become formalized and rigid, and then they just become degraded practice which doesn't serve the original purpose. So anyway, Shankaracharya comes up, he brushes past the untouchable brushes past Shankaracharya, and Shankaracharya scolds him and says, "What have you done? You've touched me," meaning now I've got to go back and take my bath again. And so then the untouchable tells him, "How could I touch you? You are not the body, nor am I. The pure self is beyond all of the 24 cosmic principles, beyond the material elements. So how can anyone touch anyone?" And then Shankaracharya suddenly realized his mistake. And so that forms the basis of the very short 5-verse text of Shankaracharya, Manisha Panchakam, verses about this experience of Shankaracharya's, where he realized in a deeper way that yes, everything is Brahman. What was I thinking? Falling back into these old social customs and forgetting the highest knowledge, falling into ignorant customs and forgetting the highest knowledge. That's a great truth that is dealt with in books like Jivan Mukti Viveka by the great Vidyaranya, who also wrote the Panchadashi. That is, that the idea, and it's dealt with in other places also, the idea that after one has realized Brahman, even after the realization of Brahman, one is liberated. But there are grades even within liberation. There's the Brahmavit, the knower of Brahman, Brahmavitvara, the greater knower of Brahman, Brahmavit Varishta, the greatest knower of Brahman. And so one has to immerse oneself in that knowledge again and again to burn out all of the old samskaras, all of the old mental habits. We see the same thing that happened to Shankaracharya happened to Swami Vivekananda. The same thing in principle, not the external events, but the same thing in principle. Swamiji had realized the self. He had had Nirvikalpa Samadhi in Kashipur. Then after Sri Ramakrishna passed away, after some time, after I forget, a couple of years, a year and a half or 2 years, he set out and began to wander. And he eventually came to Khetri in Rajasthan and was staying with the Raja of Khetri, who became one of his very important disciples, who played a very important part in Swamiji's life. And so this was when they were first acquainted. So Swamiji was staying in the palace as a guest of the king. And at night, the king sent word to Swamiji's room that they were having entertainment, that a dancing girl was going to be singing devotional songs, and that she was a very fine, trained classical singer. Swamiji should come and enjoy the spiritual music. And Swamiji sent back word that, no, I won't come. Because she's at that time, a dancing girl meant usually that she also might well act as a prostitute as well. That was the way that things worked at that time, just as women in the theater were often prostitutes as well, or it was prostitutes who became actresses in the theater. And so with dancing girls. So Swamiji said no, he wouldn't attend the entertainment because of her bad character. And so then the word reached her ears that this guest sannyasi was not coming because of her. And so then she sings this beautiful song about how there's the iron in the knife of the butcher, and there's the iron in the deity's sword in the temple. But both of them, when they touch the philosopher's stone, are turned to gold. That is, both of them are turned to gold when they reach God. And so, O Lord, you who are Samadarshi, you who are the same-sided one, look not on my faults. And she sang it with such beauty and such pathos. The sound reached Swamiji in his quarters, and he realized his great mistake, that he had dared to judge this person when he knew that all beings are Brahman, that all beings are God. And even during Sri Ramakrishna's lifetime, he had said, if I ever get the chance, I will take this idea of the worship of God in man and spread it around the world. And here he was acting contrary to that, judging someone and thinking himself superior. And so he came out of his room himself weeping and came to the audience hall and listened to the singer with great remorse for his having judged her. So both of these incidents, again, the incident of Shankaracharya with the untouchable and Swamiji's with the dancing girl, show that even after Brahmajnana, a person can still have old mental habits when they are in the normal realm. And that those, if the person remains in the body for over time, those are washed away through experiences, through the repeated experience of Brahmajnana and through the experiences of life, like this with Shankaracharya and Swamiji. And you find that was what happened to Totapuri. It's many people, many of us, think of Totapuri as a person who didn't, who had poor understanding. He'd come to Sri Ramakrishna taught him Nirvikalpa Samadhi, taught him the way to full Brahmajnana, identity with Brahman and Nirvikalpa Samadhi and all of that. But he was a second-rate hero because he had all of these other problems that Sri Ramakrishna had to teach him. No, Totapuri was a liberated soul. He was free. He had attained to liberation. He was a great saint already. He could sit still and put his mind into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the highest state. But the problem was he still had some of these old habits of mind when he came down to this state. He had not learned to live that Brahmajnana at this state. He could transcend all of this, leave it behind. This is all Maya, forget it, get out of it. Let me go and remain in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But when the mind came back to the relative plane, he still knew that I am Brahman and I can go back to that anytime I want to, but he didn't know how to act according to that. And so there were incidents like his getting angry at the worker who came over to his dhuni fire, the fire that sadhus would build at night in order to sit in front of and to meditate. So he and Sri Ramakrishna were sitting in front of his Totapuri's dhuni fire, talking of spiritual things. The worker came over to take a coal from the fire to light his pipe, his tobacco chillum. And Totapuri got furious with him and scolded him for daring to defile his sacred fire by using it to light a chillum. And Sri Ramakrishna laughed and said, so you say day and night that nothing but Brahman exists, and yet Brahman comes to take Brahman from Brahman, and you get angry at Brahman. And so then Totapuri realized his mistake. Yes, that his mind was falling into old habits of thought. He had not completely washed his mind clear of all old habits of thought when he was in the normal plane. So even before that, if Totapuri had died, he would have been identified with Brahman, liberated, not born again. But again, the idea is that there are higher states, as Sri Ramakrishna said to Swami Vivekananda, to Narendra, when he asked Narendra, what is it that you want as your ideal, the ideal you want to attain? And Narendra said, I want to attain to samadhi and remain in samadhi day and night, but come down only once in a while to eat a little food and then to go back into samadhi and remain there. And Sri Ramakrishna said, fie on you. That's a very low ideal for one like you. I thought that you were much greater than that you would be a great banyan tree under which countless people would take shelter. So for the ordinary sadhaka, the ordinary spiritual aspirant, yes, Swamiji was speaking of a high ideal, to be able to attain to samadhi at all, and then to be able to remain in samadhi, what a high state that would be. But Sri Ramakrishna knew that there were higher states than that, and that Narendra was worthy of something higher, that he was satisfying himself with something much lower than what he should. And so again, the idea that there, even in the state of Brahmajnana, there are degrees. Not in Brahman. We're talking about when a person returns from the experience of Brahmajnana, how they manifest it here, how the body and mind continue to manifest it here. And so again, in texts like Jivan Mukti Viveka and some others, they say that one should repeat the experience over and over until all the dross of the mind is burnt out. And one knows that there is nothing but Brahman, and one acts from that knowledge, that all is Brahman. So again, this came from the discussion of faith. That Shankaracharya had the faith that he was Brahman. Shankaracharya had the faith that he was Brahman, but not deeply enough. But after he was challenged by the untouchable, which according to the story, to me, this sort of ruins the stories, but it was the convention of ancient times. Suddenly the untouchable reveals himself to have been Shiva himself, who was testing Shankaracharya. So why that ruins the story for me is that means it wasn't really an untouchable at all, and so Shankaracharya hadn't been touched by an untouchable, so he's safe. It is actually Shiva who is doing this. But too many of the ancient stories, they end in a way which sort of defeats the very lesson which they're trying to teach. But that is what it is. And so then he also tells the story of Jarabharata, the one who had been the king who retired from his kingdom to practice austerities and then became attached to a pet deer. A deer wandered into his compound and he took it as a pet. And he loved the deer so much that he became worldly by thinking of the deer all the time. Worldly meaning that he was so attached to the deer, he forgot about his spiritual practice and was just spent his time worrying about the welfare of the deer. And then he died. And because of his attachment to the deer, he was reborn as a deer. So then the next birth, after he had paid for the attachment that he had, then he was reborn as this Jadabharata, who from his childhood he never spoke. And so his parents and others thought that he was dumb, and also dumb, as we say in English, meaning not be able to speak, and dumb in English, as we say, meaning stupid, both, that he was dumb in both senses. So then, I won't go into the whole story, but he ends up being taken by this king to bear his palanquin. And then he begins to speak about the knowledge of Brahman, and the king is astounded at this man who seemed to be a dunce, and discovers that he was a knower of Brahman. So that also, Sri Ramakrishna said that Jarabharata had the firm faith that he was Brahman. And the faith here means he actually had the experience that he was Brahman. Let me draw a parallel. In Christianity, they didn't have all of the yogas delineated as we have in Hinduism, but what they did have was prayer. And so prayer became the main spiritual discipline in Christianity. And so prayer was highly developed because just as a person who is missing one of the senses, like sight or hearing or both, their other senses become extremely much more sensitive, much more acute. They take on the power. They compensate for the missing senses. In the same way, now I'm sorry, I forgot. I've lost track of where I was going with that. But Jarabharata, anyway, he was thought to be stupid because he didn't learn to speak. But he didn't speak because he remembered his life as King Bharata and also as the deer, which he had to live to pay for having been attached to the pet deer. So then when he's born again, he decides, I'm not going to get involved in Maya whatsoever. I'm not going to involve myself in Maya, so I won't speak. So he, from his birth, he had that fixed determination, I want to attain Brahman, that which had been his reason for leaving his kingdom 2 lifetimes before. So now he had his experience. He knew the danger of attachment. So I'm not going to attach myself to anything. I'm going to be free. I'm going to fix my mind on Brahman, and I'm not going to talk and engage myself with the world. And so he kept his mind free and eventually came to the realization of Brahman. So faith, I was talking about Christianity and how prayer developed in Christianity. And so just as when a person loses 1 or 2 senses, the other senses become more acute. So in Christianity, because they didn't have other spiritual disciplines, they had prayer. Prayer became a focal point of development. So all of the spiritual energy went into the development of prayer. So you find there a magnificent development of prayer as a spiritual discipline, more than in other traditions. So the Now I've lost my point again. I don't know what's wrong today, but I was going somewhere with that concentration on prayer. Oh, yes. So faith. If you have deep faith in something, uh, it leads to the goal, just as in prayer in Christianity. That whole thing about the concentrated energy in Christianity, that was a tangent. That's why I kept getting lost on it. It was to background for the main point that in Christianity, prayer became something which would take you from vocal prayers in church, where you would say out loud prayers that were written in front of you, all the way to the deep interior prayer, which became meditation, dhyana, and which became samadhi, the prayer of union, and then different levels of the prayer of union as are different levels of samadhi. So prayer would lead you all the way to the highest truth. So with faith, this was the point I kept trying to come back to. So with faith, faith begins as a sense that something is real, but I don't really understand it much. I don't know it, but I have a sense that there's something here. And that faith grows and grows until faith blossoms into direct experience. So again, that was the comparison, that prayer goes from vocal prayer, which is anyone can do, just reading a prayer in front of you from a prayer book and saying it out loud and trying to feel it, all the way up to the highest mystical union, which is the highest samadhi. And so with faith is similar to that. It goes from faith that is just a slight sense that, yes, God probably exists. I think that God exists. It feels like God exists. And then you develop faith until your faith becomes almost vision. Faith, when it becomes strong, you feel that you almost sense God. You almost feel God. You offer a flower on the altar during puja, and you feel that God is accepting it. You feel that God is there. You don't see God as God. You see the image, but you feel when you offer the flower that it's actually being accepted. And you feel that God is there accepting it. And then finally, that comes to experience. And so Jada Bharata, as Sri Ramakrishna said, he had the faith that he was Brahman, but that faith which led to the direct experience that he was Brahman. So last thing let me say about that, because I've gone a long way on a tangent here, is that for people on the path of knowledge, as Jada Bharata was, the faith, the conviction that I am Brahman, that is extremely important, because that is really what takes us to the realization of Brahman. You start by understanding, hearing, reasoning about it, thinking about it until you get a good conceptual understanding of why it is that I am Brahman, even though I experience myself to be this individual separate from the rest of the universe. So I've thought about it, I've heard about it, I've reasoned it out, and now I'm convinced that I am Brahman. So you begin with that faith on the path of knowledge, and it's just as in devotion, you use faith to come to God. In the path of knowledge, you use faith to come to the experience of identity with Brahman. And so in both cases, it's the emphasis of faith. And so that's why Sri Ramakrishna emphasizes faith. He, Jada Bharata, had perfect faith that he was the pure self. Then Sri Ramakrishna continues, I am he, I am the pure self. That is the conclusion of the Jnanis. But the Bhaktas say, the whole universe is the glory of God. Who would recognize a wealthy man without his power and riches? But it is quite different when God himself, gratified by the aspirant's devotion, says to him, you are the same as myself. Suppose a king is seated in his court, and his cook enters the hall, sits on the throne, and says, O king, you and I are the same. People will certainly call him a madman. But suppose one day the king, pleased with the cook's service, says to him, come, sit beside me. There's nothing wrong in that. There's no difference between you and me. Then if the cook sits on the throne with the king, there is no harm in it. It is not good for ordinary people to say, I am he. The waves belong to the water. Does the water belong to the waves? So here Sri Ramakrishna is talking about the difference between the jnani and the bhakta, and advising for most people the path of the bhakta. And again, there are exceptions. There are those who are more cut out for the path of knowledge. But as I often say, numerically, there are more people who follow the path of devotion because it's much easier to understand, and there's the less danger of hypocrisy and egotism. So Sri Ramakrishna says that God can say to the devotee, you and I are the same. Come, you are the same as me, and reveals to the devotee the non-dualistic state. And that is good. Sri Ramakrishna said to devotees sometimes that when they would ask about non-dualism, if they were on the path of devotion, and he would say that leave that to God. If you need the non-dual experience, then God will give that to you. You just go towards God, and whatever you need, that will come to you. Don't worry about that at this point. If you need it, it will come. And so the idea again is that for the bhakta seeks God and seeks that which, if they have a desire for non-dualism, then they seek that from God. That is not I am he, but, oh, Mother, please open the door to knowledge to me. I want to experience the self. So they look on God as the one who holds the key to non-dual knowledge. And so therefore they ask it of God. The jnani is one who bypasses that and just says, no, I want to realize that. I'm not interested in the devotional path or any of that. I just want to realize the self. So both paths are good, but as Sri Ramakrishna often said, most people will find the path of devotion much better and much less a much less dangerous path, and therefore a much more successful path. So as he would often say, the waves belong to the water. The water doesn't belong, the ocean doesn't belong to the waves. And so we are waves in the ocean of God. So the wave is made of water and the ocean is water, nothing but water. And so in that sense, there's no distinction between the individual and the reality. But as a wave, I'm a part of the ocean. I belong to the ocean. I can't claim ownership of the ocean. So, of course, again, the jnani's idea is different. They just think in terms of water, not in terms of waves and all of that. But for the bhakta, I start out as feeling my closeness to God. Then I come to the Vishishtadvaitic experience of feeling that I'm of the same nature of God, but I am Anu and God is Vibhu. I am small and God is vast. I'm limited and God is unlimited, but I'm of the same nature. And then then through the grace of God, the devotee can also realize identity. So Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of the cook who comes in on his own authority and just goes and climbs onto the throne with the king and says, "O king, what you are, that I am also." And that, of course, would be highly inappropriate. But if the king calls the cook, pleased with his service, and says, "Come, sit by me. There's no harm in it. Sit with me. You and I are the same." Then one sits on the throne with God and becomes identified with God. So the question of self-effort or seeking the grace of God. So he continues, the upshot of the whole thing is that no matter what path you follow, yoga is impossible unless the mind becomes quiet. The mind of a yogi is under his control. He is not under the control of his mind. When the mind is quiet, the prana stops functioning. Then one gets kumbhaka. One may have the same kumbhaka through bhakti yoga as well. The prana stops functioning through love of God too. In the kirtan, the musician sings, Nitai Amar Mata Hati, meaning that my Nitai, that is Nityananda, the companion of Sri Chaitanya, my Nitai dances like a mad elephant. Repeating this, he goes into a spiritual mood and cannot sing the whole sentence. He simply sings hati, hati, hati. When the mood deepens, he only sings ha, ha, ha. Thus his prana stops through ecstasy and kumbhaka follows. So let me read the next paragraph and then explain the two together. Suppose a man is sweeping a courtyard with his broom, and another man comes and says to him, "Hello, so-and-so is no more. He's dead." Now, if the dead person was not related to the sweeper, the latter goes on with his work, remarking casually, "Ah, that's too bad. He's dead. He was a good fellow." The sweeping goes on all the same. But if the dead man was his relative, then the broom drops from his hand. "Ah," he exclaims, and he too drops to the ground. His prana has stopped functioning. He can neither work nor think. Haven't you noticed among women that if one of them looks at something or listens to something in speechless amazement, the other women say to her, "What, are you in ecstasy?" Or I think in Bengali, "Ki tor bhav legeche." Ki tor bhav legeche. Are you in ecstasy, or you are in bhava? In this instance, too, the prana has stopped functioning, and so she remains speechless with mouth agape. So again, coming back to these two paragraphs, that whatever path you follow, you want to make the mind quiet. The mind has to become still. So the yogi does it directly by working on the mind itself. Yoga is the psychological path. So the yogi works at stilling the mind. The jnani works at disidentifying with the mind and its thoughts so that the mind begins to become still, because I become the witness of the mind. I'm no longer involved with it, feeding it, following it, stimulating it, etc. I try to remain as the silent witness, and gradually the mind no longer get starved of the attention it was getting, the identification it was getting. It becomes quiet. And the bhakta through love of God. And so then he gives the example of what happens in kirtan when one goes into ecstasy. Well, one other thing I should explain first before coming to that, he mentions the word kumbhaka. So most of you know kumbhaka and pranayama. You breathe in, that's the rechaka, no, puraka, and you breathe out, that's rechaka, and then you hold the breath, you hold it inside, that's kumbhaka. So kumbhaka means the stopping of the breath. So if you do pranayama, following the practices of yoga, then you're trying to bring the breathing process under control. And eventually, through that process, the breathing becomes finer and finer until you get such control over the breathing process, the prana which drives the breathing process, that the breathing stops for a long period of time. And so that kumbhaka, that stopping of the breathing, which is really the stilling of the prana. Again, prana is not breath. Prana is the vital force which drives the breathing. And so it's by controlling the breathing that we get hold of the prana which is behind it, the prana which animates the mind and the body both, the life force. And so in kumbhaka, the prana becomes still, and then the mind becomes still, the body becomes still, the mind becomes still. So again, coming back to bhakti yoga, he says that in kirtan, one sings Amar Nitai Matahati, or Nitaya, where were the words? Nitai Amar Matahati. Actually, the Bengali doesn't say anything about dancing. It's just my Nitai, mad elephant. But it's understood in the context that he's talking about Nitai dancing in ecstasy during the kirtan, the great companion of Sri Chaitanya. So the singer singing that, Nitai Amar Matahati, starts going into ecstasy in the intensity of the kirtan and can only say hati, 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 hati. the rest of the words fall away, and then finally it's only ha, 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 ha. They can't even say the word hati. And then the prana stops altogether, and even that they can't say. One goes into ecstasy. So through kirtan, one can go into ecstasy. Through japa, one can stop the prana also. In japa, normally when we do japa, it's sort of a mechanical process. The mind is thinking of many things, and we go on repeating it while the mind is wandering all over the three worlds. But a time comes after long practice of japa when the mind begins to settle on the japa itself. It begins to follow the stream of japa and becomes involved in the saying of it. And then it moves into the purely mental repetition. And then we feel that it's trying to refine itself. And so we try to follow the repetition of the japa, the sound of the japa. We try to follow it. And as we do that, the mind becomes more and more absorbed in it. And a time comes where we even feel that my breathing is getting so much in the way. I can't concentrate because of the breathing. The breathing is such a botheration while you're repeating the mantra mentally, that you even sometimes hold the breath intentionally in order to concentrate more deeply. So there's a strange statement, strange at first until you understand this, a strange statement in Holy Mother. I've only seen it in one place in her teachings, where she's telling someone, a disciple, that yes, sometimes you have to stop the breathing while doing a japa. And that comes because you come to a point. This is not something you do just because you decide to do it. You wait until the japa has led you to that point, and you know to do it when that time comes. So again, this isn't something that you say, okay, I'm going to start holding my breath while I do japa. No, don't do that. That's dangerous. But a time comes where the japa becomes so intense, your mind is so focused on it, that you just wish, oh, I wish I could get the breath out of the way. It's such a botheration. I'm trying to get just the mantra, nothing else. And yet there's this, even if you're breathing very, very softly and your breathing has become very refined, even that becomes a botheration. And so then you start trying to stop the breath for as long as you can to get japa without the botheration of breathing. And so eventually that leads to kumbhaka, to the stopping of the breath. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna is talking about, the different ways in which the breath can be stopped, because that leads to samadhi. He talks about the sweeper, a very beautiful incident, beautiful because meaningful. The sweeper is it's not a sweeper in the Indian sense, but a man is sweeping the courtyard, and someone comes and tells him that, oh, so and so has died. And this man just keeps sweeping and saying, oh, that's too bad. He was such a nice guy. And just expresses some sympathy with the family and things while he continues to sweep. But if it was somebody very dear to the sweeper, and this was unexpected news, say they bring news that your son just died, or your wife just died, or your mother just died, then the person is overcome. They drop the broom, and perhaps they fall to the ground unconscious. And so he's using that as an example of stopping of the breath, that the life force becomes still through the intensity of the thought. And so here it's the intensity of the experience of having lost the sudden news that my dear one has passed away completely unexpectedly. And so you overcome. So like that, one becomes completely absorbed in the idea, whether it's through kirtan, whether it's through pranayama, whether it's through japa, whether it's through meditation, whether it's through discrimination, self-analysis, and dissociating from the mind and body. But then comes kumbhaka, the stilling of the breath. So we'll stop here and continue next time near the top of page 249. So let me give announcements, and then if there are any questions, I will take those. So, announcements. On Sunday, I will speak on the Holy Mother. Uh, I had decided to speak on the Holy Mother on this coming Sunday because we were originally, as most of you know, planning to have Holy Mother's Puja on December 22nd, her solar calendar birthday. But we've thought better of it after discussing it with the devotees, and we decided to move Holy Mother's birthday celebration to January 1st because that is always a holiday. And so we're planning to make January 1st from here on the day every year we celebrate Holy Mother's birthday. So it'll be combined Holy Mother's birthday with the puja and Kalpataru Day, as they do in Dallas and also in San Francisco. So no puja on the 22nd. However, on Sunday, I still will speak about Holy Mother. And then next week, we will have the classes as usual, except, let's see, next Thursday is Christmas Eve. So there'll be no class on Christmas Eve. We will have a Christmas Eve service. And I believe we've sent out notice about the Christmas Eve service. So now in between Christmas and New Year's, there'll be no classes or lectures. So now questions. So which is the highest state of realization, or is there no end to it? What about those who are liberated but not reached the highest state? Are they born again? So yes, a good question, because oftentimes we get the idea that liberation is one thing, and enlightenment, liberation is one thing. No, Sri Ramakrishna told Gopalarma, after she had the repeated vision of Sri Krishna, said that you have attained to everything, meaning that she was liberated. There would be no more birth for her. Even after that, she continued to have spiritual experiences. She came to the point where she saw Sri Krishna in everything, and she used to address everybody as her Gopala, because she saw Gopala within everyone. But she had come to the point where the sense of being the agent of action, being the doer, that was over. So liberation, technically, liberation means knowing that, experiencing, not just knowing intellectually, conceptually, but having the complete experience that I am not the doer. God is the doer, or nature is the doer, and I'm the self. So God is the doer, and I'm the servant of God, but God acts through me, or I am the self, and I have nothing to do with action. Either way, one is freed from karma. And when we're freed from karma, we're freed from rebirth. So then there's no rebirth. We may not have even had the highest knowledge, but we may get to Krama Mukti. We may go to Brahma Loka, which for the devotees of Ramakrishna will be seen as Ramakrishna Loka. And there remain in a highly spiritual state until the end of the cycle, and then realize Brahman along with Brahma himself. So as far as realization, so there's liberation is one thing. Liberation means that you no longer are tied to the cycles of birth and death. Enlightenment is another thing. Enlightenment talks about the experience. So liberation comes through experience, but you need you need an experience high enough that cuts the bondage of thinking that you are the doer. But enlightenment is speaking about the experience itself. And so in enlightenment, there are degrees. In liberation, there's not a degree except if one is completely liberated in this life, or one goes to Krama Mukti. But in enlightenment, one has degrees of experience. If one realizes Brahman, the non-dual Brahman, and one's identity with Brahman, then one has realized the same Brahman that the incarnations have realized. So in Brahman, there are no degrees. It's when we come back here to this plane that there are degrees of manifestation. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says the only difference between an incarnation of God and an ordinary liberated jiva is one of the degree of power. The incarnation manifests tremendous power here and liberates many people in their lifetime, and then millions of people for ages after that. They continue to liberate because they have that power. An ordinary jiva like you or me, if we attain to identity with Brahman, the highest enlightenment, we may have the power to help a few people and to grant liberation to 2 or 3 or something like that through our direct blessing, and to inspire many others. But again, it's a very limited power compared to the incarnation. And so if we've known our identity with Brahman, we've known the same Brahman that others have known. But as Holy Mother and Sri Ramakrishna said, some have smelled the ocean from a distance. Some have gotten closer and seen it from a hilltop. Others have gone to the shore. Some have even taken water and tasted it from the ocean. And some have bathed in the ocean. So Brahman is the infinite, not the infinite in that there are all kinds of things there to do and to see and to experience. But there is no limit to Brahman, and so there is, in a sense, the deeper and deeper experience of identity with Brahman, and that especially applies again to the person coming back here, how much they manifest. So if we're liberated, no, we don't need to be born again. Although it's said, both in some Vedantins, not all Vedantins accept this, but some do, and Swamiji did, and in Buddhism both, there's the idea that some people have the strong intention that I want to work for the welfare of others. And so they enter liberation with that intention that I am going to attain the liberation in order to help other beings. And so they may have the power to return to help others in their path. Swami Brahmananda also said, because he had seen them in his mystic states, that there are many holy people of the past who remain in an enlightened state, but remain short of merging into Brahman in order to be of service to other spiritual aspirants. Like when he was in Vrindavan after Sri Ramakrishna's passing away, performing austerities. At midnight, a sage would appear, a sage who had been liberated, not in the body, but would appear and wake him up and tell him it's time for meditation, get up and meditate. And so things like that may happen to an advanced spiritual aspirant because such people continue to live. Then is the stopping of the breath only momentary, or does it continue for a while? If so, does it harm the body in any way? So that depends. If you're practicing kumbhaka, or if it's you're entering into kumbhaka naturally through the process of kirtan and so forth, that's for a period. And then it starts again. The body kicks in again, the prana kicks in again, and the breathing process continues. But, of course, if one attains to nirvikalpa samadhi, then the breath continues it can stop for a long time. And no, that does not harm the body. We don't know the physiology of it because what doctors have had the chance to study in detail in a laboratory setting, people in nirvikalpa samadhi. It doesn't happen. And so we don't know how or why. But we see in the case of Sri Ramakrishna, and it's said of others also who attain to deep samadhi, that the breathing stops for a long time. And yet it doesn't harm the body or the mind, even though the mind would be starved of oxygen. But the idea is that all of the vital processes stop. And so we can guess, and this, of course, is only a guess, we can guess that because the vital processes stop, that therefore the need for oxygenation is suspended for the time being. And then one other thing that we say, there are the cases which even now you sometimes see in India, of people who learn suspended animation through yogic hatha yoga processes. They haven't attained to nirvikalpa samadhi, but they are able to stop their heartbeat and stop their breathing. And so these are the yogis that you see or you hear about and maybe see if you're lucky, who are buried underground for several days, and then later the devotees come and dig them up, and they're still in the Jada Samadhi, and they're quite healthy, even though there was no air because they were buried for several days. So that also is possible. So that was that hatha yogic tradition, which was just suspended animation, not samadhi of the mind, that was learned by observing creatures like frogs who go into hibernation. So, how to control the tongue and the craving of food, and should one do fasting on Vaikuntha Ekadashis, etc. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that he didn't like to see women fasting because he looked on women as the Divine Mother, and it made him uncomfortable to see women undergoing fasting. So that doesn't mean you can't fast, but it does mean that you have Sri Ramakrishna's blessings if you don't want to fast, because he didn't like to see it. He didn't like to see women undergoing severe practices because of his reverence for the Divine Mother, especially manifested as all women. So that's fast if you find it beneficial. Don't fast if you find it troublesome or difficult, and certainly not if you have health problems, certainly not if you have diabetes or stomach troubles and things like that. Otherwise, do it only if you find benefit from it, and to a limited extent. So how to control the tongue and craving for food? You don't do it by directly thinking, I'm not going to crave food, because then you start craving it even more. You just learn to divert the mind elsewhere. One thing that you can do, a positive thing you can do, I mean, a positive practice is that when you are eating something that you really crave, then stop while you're eating it and think, I'll give the example as Sri Ramakrishna gave it. If you're eating a rasagola, so this applies to anything, if it's chocolate ice cream or whatever it is that you love, while you're eating it, say, using the rasagola example, this is rasagola. This is what people crave so much. It's no big deal. When you actually focus on something that you crave while you're enjoying it, you see, it's just a sensation. It's just a sensation. Why do I let this control my life so much? It's just a sensation. So every time that you can do it, when you're eating something you crave, just stop and think of it and just look at what you're doing and look at the taste and say, yes, it tastes good, but it's not that special. It's just a good sensation. That's all it is. Why should I go crazy for it? And otherwise, learn to divert your mind. So I think that's all. Yeah, that's all for today. So I'll give the closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha.